Hey, how's it going, everyone? It's Blake here from chesspathways.com, and in today's openings video, we're going to be talking about the Closed Sicilian. The Sicilian defense, of course, begins with e4, c5, and in the Closed Sicilian, instead of opening the center with knight f3 and pawn to d4, white's going to keep that center closed for now. They're often going to fianchetto this light-squared bishop and try to slowly build up on the king side. So white often plays here knight to c3, black can play knight c6, and now pawn to g3. This is the move order I most often think of when I think of the Closed Sicilian. There's a couple other ways white can implement this plan. One is to play an early f4, often in conjunction with bishop c4 or bishop b5, and that does indeed keep the center closed for the time being, but I would consider that a Grand Prix attack instead of the Closed Sicilian. So I can go ahead and put a link in the description to my video on the Grand Prix attack as well. But in the traditional Closed Sicilian, this bishop's going to come to g2. That's going to be a nice defender here for the white king as white expands these pawns on the king side. So let's take a look at a sample line here. Black can play g6. Just like in the Grand Prix attack, black often wants to put this bishop on g7. It's not only going to help defend their king from white's onslaught on the king side, but it also helps pressure the queen side, which is where black has their space advantage. Black will often want to expand on the queen side and play on that sector of the board. So bishop g2, bishop g7, d3, black can play d6 and open up the other bishop. One other thing we notice here, compared to, let's say, a Grand Prix attack, this bishop on g2 also helps influence the d5 square, and that makes it a lot harder for black to get in this d5 break, for example, with e6 and d5. Black can sometimes play for that, but it's a bit harder here. Really, neither side has an easy time breaking with the d-pawn anymore, and that's why the center is going to stay closed, and play kind of shifts to the flanks of the board, which is what white's going for. So bishop e3, white keeps on developing, pawn to e6, queen d2, rook b8. This is a very common idea. Black wants to push b5 and grab some more space on the queen side. Now comes knight g to e2. This is a common square for the knight here, just not getting in the way of this f-pawn because white eventually wants to expand on the king side. The knight could come to f3 in some lines. White could play pawn to f4 first and then f3, or even just not play an early f4 at all. There's some lines where white doesn't have to play f4 too early, but this is a very common plan for white. So let's see how this can go. Pawn to b5, castles, b4. Black kicks that knight away, but the knight's happy to just regroup here on the back rank. It might come to f2 later, or e3, trying to help out on the king side, and for the time being, it also watches over this b2 pawn, which this bishop has in its sights. So now knight to d4. This is another common theme in the Closed Sicilian. Black's often not too afraid of getting doubled pawns here, because if white were to take on d4 and black took back, then there could be a lot of pressure here down the c-file. This c2 pawn is backwards, has a hard time moving forward because of the pawns on b4 and d4, and black could look to put a lot of pressure on that pawn later. So often white just ignores that for now, and in fact sometimes they even retreat this knight on e2. They play knight c1, making sure this knight can't even exchange itself off, because white wants to drive it away later with pawn to c3. So this line might continue with knight e7, black develops another piece, c3, this does open up some lines here on the queen side. This does give an open file to the rook, but it also drives this knight away. So the knight has to come back to c6, bishop h6, trying to get rid of this key defender of the black king. Castles, takes, and now knight e3. Now this gives black an opportunity to lock down the center for the time being with e5, trying to clamp down on both f4 and d4, but it's really hard to stop f4. White's probably going to get to play it anyways. So if black plays e5 here, white can just bring this knight back to e2. Black could play bishop a6, trying to target this potentially weak d3 pawn, maybe thinking about playing c4 at some point, but now comes f4. And black probably doesn't want to allow f5 here. That would really give white the superior position over here on the king side, so black could play f6. And at least now, if white plays f5, black could even think about playing g5, trying to keep all the lines locked. But one idea white could have is just to play g4 and continue expansion here on the king side. And again, we see this bishop's a great defender of the king. You usually have to be a little concerned about pushing all the pawns in front of your king, but this bishop really helps this king still feel safe. And just coming back here a few moves to when white played knight e3, again, I mentioned white could play f4 right away, just to make sure black can't even play e5. I just wanted to show one sample line of how black could react here. We saw black reacting with f6 against white's f4 move in the last line. In this line, black could play here queen b6, threaten some discoveries here. White could play rook f2, not only stopping the discoveries, but also thinking about doubling on the f-file. But here black could play f5. That's another common reaction when white pushes f4, just trying to shut down white's activity there on the f-file and fight back for space in the center. That's one very important thing to understand when it comes to defending these positions as black in the Closed Sicilian. A lot of players are taught that in these kind of positions, you just push forward on the queen side, you let white push forward on the king side, because that's where you each have your space advantage, and you see who wins the race. But it can be dangerous to do that because your king's over here. So even if you win the race on the queen side and, pick up a pawn or two, you might find yourself getting checkmated. So very often black does have to fight back on the king side. They have to push f5 or f6, or take some preventative measures over here to stop white's attack from getting too strong. Let's take a look at one more sample line. Coming back here to the beginning, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, d3, d6, bishop e3, e6. In the last line, we looked at what happens if white plays just queen d2, knight e2, castles, kind of delaying this move f4 for the time being, and we saw that white used that to be able to play bishop h6 before playing f4. So that's one idea. Let's take a look at what happens if white just plays f4 right away. I found a very interesting game played in this continuation. So f4, knight g to e7, knight f3. That's one of the benefits of this line. This knight can still come to f3 without blocking in that f-pawn. Black goes for this knight d4 idea once again, and now comes castles, castles, and e5. This is another break. Often in the Closed Sicilian and the Grand Prix attack, you think about white trying to get this f5 break in, but especially with the bishop on g2, pushing e5 could be helpful, trying to open this bishop up. d5 would be pretty positionally desirable here for black, just taking some more space in the center, but it's not really possible here because then white can simply take this knight, the bishop's been cut off, and white just wins a pawn. So after e5, black has to do something else. Black could play here knight e to f5, attacking the bishop, bishop back to f2, and once again, you might think black could play d5 here, but it's going to be pretty hard to defend your d4 pawn. For example, d5, knight takes, pawn takes, and knight b5, and this pawn is very loose. One key point is that queen b6 doesn't work because knight takes d4 comes anyways, and there's going to be some pins here, and white's going to pick up their piece back. So I always like showing these kind of split-off lines from the game. Even though they didn't happen, it's important to see what both players were calculating behind the scenes. So after bishop back to f2, black played knight takes f3, queen takes f3, the other knight takes its place on d4, queen back to d1, d takes e5, black wants to open up lines for this dark bishop again, f takes e5, bishop takes e5, so black won a pawn for the time being. But now this rook got an open file, and now comes knight e4, and the c5 pawn is potentially weak. c3 could be coming next. We've seen this idea before. Make sure this knight can't exchange itself off too easily, and then kick it away with c3, so black has to watch out for that. And in this game, black struck back on the king side like we've talked about, with pawn to f5. Just making sure that after this knight takes that pawn, that black can kick it with queen c7, and now it doesn't have this e4 square to go back to. So instead, white defends it with pawn to b4, and now black pushes forward with pawn to f4. I really like this game because this idea is not one that most people think of when they think of the Closed Sicilian. Black pushing this pawn all the way to f4. Usually you think of white having the space advantage over there on the king side. But here, both players are kind of playing on both sides of the board, and it's a very interesting game we have. So c3, kicking the knight away, knight back to f5, and white plays g4, just kicking that knight away and keeping those lines closed on the king side for now. And black played an in-between move here, pawn to f3, picking up the h2 pawn. Of course, this is pretty far outside the scope of discussing the Closed Sicilian, but I did want to show this sample game just to show you how to think outside the box, right? You can't just always follow the opening plans you hear about in a brief overview of the opening. You really have to still be calculating, coming up with your own ideas, and I like black's creativity here, expanding all the way to f3 on the king side. I'll just show a few more moves. Bishop takes f3, bishop takes h2, we trade pawns, king g2, knight back to g7, the knight finally has to save itself, rook h1, pawn to d4, and now knight takes d7 and queen d3, and white should be a bit better here. We have equal material, but black has this potentially weak e6 pawn, and white has a very strong bishop pair. Black succeeded in kind of opening some lines on the king side, and this king might be a bit more vulnerable than black's if you only look at the pawn structure around the king, but again, these bishops are very strong, especially this unopposed light-squared bishop that white brought there on move 4, when they fianchettoed on the king side. Alright, thanks for watching everyone. Please make sure you visit chesspathways.com and get signed up today. It's totally free, only takes 5 seconds, and I'll send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you sign up. It took me way too long to become a chess master, and I want to help you do it in a fraction of the time. Thanks, and I will see you there.